Anirodhamanutpadamanuच्छedamashashvatam Anekarthamananarthamanagamam Yah pratitya samutpadam prapanchopashamam shivam Deshayamasa sambuddhastam vande vadatam varam Nasvato napi parato nadvabhyam napyahetutah Utpanna jatu vidyante bhava kvachana kechana. Welcome back to our Dharmapada class. The teaching of the Buddha has only one intention: to liberate us from the cycle of cause and effect, which leads to birth, old age, disease, suffering, and again to birth, old age, disease, suffering. The path of the Buddha is known as the Eightfold Path, of which the right understanding is the beginning. The right understanding means that we gain a basic insight into how cause and effect work outwardly and innerly. I will go through the Dharmapada a little faster now because you all have some basic taste now of what the teaching is about. So we can then go through the verses a little quicker, and I can go into more detail where there is an interesting story or an important point. Even as in a heap of dirt thrown out by the road, eventually there can grow a lotus of pure fragrance that is delightful to the mind. Thus, among the many beings who are like dust, who are utterly blind, there can emerge a disciple of the perfectly and completely enlightened Buddha, sparkling with wisdom. I'm going through the verses now, and then I will talk about the stories and the deeper explanations. We now begin the 5th chapter, which is called the chapter about the fools, the foolish ones, or the immature ones. It can also be translated. The Buddha says, "Long is the night for someone who is awake and can't sleep. Long is the journey for someone who is exhausted. And long is samsara, the cycle of death, rebirth, old age, sickness, and again death, for the foolish ones who do not understand true Dharma. If a traveler does not find a companion who is better or similar to himself, then one should resolutely travel alone. There is no companionship with a fool." This means be careful with whom you travel through life. Your journey through life, as well as your spiritual journey, is very important, and therefore be careful whom you choose as your companion. The Buddha says, "A fool worries, 'I have children, I have wealth,' yet he does not even own his own body. How could he really own children or wealth?" This means in just an instant, impermanence and death will take away our body. How did we really own it? And if we don't even own our own body, how can we really own children or wealth? The Buddha says, realizing and gaining insight into one's own foolishness makes a fool slowly but surely become a wise person. But a fool who proudly considers himself wise is indeed called a fool and remains a fool. So there is always a way out. If we realize our foolishness and gain insight into our foolishness by observing ourselves, by being aware again and again, then slowly but surely our foolishness recedes and we become wise. But if we engage in pride and conceit, thinking that the little bit of knowledge and expertise that we have makes us wise, when in fact we are foolish, then we will always remain a fool. The Buddha says, a fool can attend on a wise man for a whole lifetime, yet he will not understand Dharma. Like a spoon does not know the taste of soup. Brilliant example. A fool who does not understand his or her foolishness and attends on a wise person, like we have all these gurus and they are surrounded by hundreds or thousands or even more disciples, but very often it is a sort of dependency upon that guru, rather than the disciples witnessing, observing themselves, practicing properly. Then it is like a spoon constantly going into the soup, but the spoon can never know the taste of the soup. So a fool who attends on a wise person for a whole lifetime but does not observe themselves can never understand Dharma. Whereas, the Buddha says, an intelligent person attends on a wise man for just a short while. Muhurtamapi, just a muhurta. Muhurta is 48 minutes. Just a short while, and quickly understands Dharma. Like the tongue which understands the taste of the soup. The Buddha says, unintelligent fools roam about as if they were their own enemies, doing negative actions which have a bitter result. That deed is not well done, which one regrets after it has been accomplished, and whose consequence one has to face with a tearful face and crying. I'll talk about this one in more detail afterwards. And the Buddha says, that deed is well done, which one does not regret after it has been accomplished, and whose consequence one faces with delight and a serene mind. The fool thinks life is like honey, but only as long as his negative deed or mental state has not ripened upon him. But when the negative deed or mental state ripens, he undergoes suffering. Month by month, a fool tries to impress others but he is not worth even a small part of those who have realized Dharma, but impress none. Even as milk does not thicken at once to become curds, no negative deed or state bears fruit instantly when it is done. It comes later. And the fool is such that the action follows him like fire is followed by smoke. The knowledge or skill of a fool is trumped only by his misfortune. It destroys the fool's good fortune and eventually tears up even his head. I'll talk about this one a little later. And the Buddha says, a fool seeks undue respect, the admiration of others, lordship over houses or dwellings, and devotion from others. A fool thinks, let everyone, the householders and the monks, think that this or that has been accomplished by me. Let them be under my sway regarding all that has been done. Such are the fancies of a fool. His desire and pride only grows. And then the last verse of the chapter. The fool always desires to gain something new, something different. Whereas the path to nirvana, to freedom, does not depend upon new things. Having fully understood this, let a monk or a disciple of the Buddha not delight in the admiration of others, but devote himself or herself to discernment, viveka, to intelligence. So now we've already done a whole chapter in just 13 minutes, but I can now go into detail with some of the verses so that we will go through the Dharmapada quicker, and now we can relax for the next 30 minutes. If a traveler does not find a companion who is better or similar to himself, then he should resolutely travel alone. There is no companionship with a fool. This is the principle of Sat Sangha, which we know from other great masters from ancient India. It is something I have rarely encountered in the West as a teaching, as a principle, that it really matters whose company we have. The people around us, whether we want it or not, influence our minds and our emotions. In my youth, Tripurasundari knows this, we had a friend who was not such a good influence on us. And some of the sort of negative developments we had in our life could be pinpointed, more or less, to exactly the moment when that person came into our life. Now, that's not a blame. You see, that's not the Buddha's view. Is not to say, oh, it was just the other person. Of course, there was something in us which responded, reacted to that, you see. But it was the lack of mindfulness, the lack of awareness, the lack of carefulness, care, considering, is that companionship really good for us? Is that really going to push us into Dharma more? Is it wholesome? Is that person filled with compassion, kindness? Is that person full of inspiration? Or is that person, in fact, a negative spiral? And of course, some of you might be thinking now that, but isn't that judging? Where is the compassion? Shouldn't we have compassion for all beings and therefore not judge and just get along with each and everybody, and whoever comes into our life, we make merry and so forth? Yes, but there is also foolish compassion. There's also compassion which drains you of your own resources, your own energy, narrows down your possibilities to only that person or that group of people. And then, in fact, you can't flower spiritually, and you can't become a true source of inspiration for others because you're stuck. So compassion is not just all the time being nice and being sweet and going along with everything. I know of someone, I don't even want to think about them, but it's just a good example. It's the sister of a person who is very, very selfish, very narcissistic. And that person has compelled for, I think, the better part of the past 40 years, his sister to always live with him and look after him. And they are now in their early 60s. And the sister is so kind, so, compassionate. But that is the foolish kind of compassion. Because she is sort of the servant of her brother. And neither has he been able to come out of that narcissism ever, because he's never really had to look at it, nor has she ever really been able to live her life the way that perhaps she had dreams when she was younger. It is like a codependency where neither of them has been able to really evolve, neither in their spiritual life nor in their worldly life. It's a very strange scenario. And I'm not judging in the sense of, I'm not limiting that, saying, ooh, I'm just genuinely, compassionately being aware of that and giving it to you as an example. Both have limited themselves through that codependency. So, very important. Right away, look at your own companions and consider what you might have to change. And I know very well that the older we get, the less we are really free to choose. Because sometimes we've married and then, fortunately, we don't have that problem. At least Tripurasundari is the most wonderful companion in all the three worlds. I don't know if she can say the same about me, but I can say it about her. So tremendously fortunate, tremendously lucky. Please don't look at us with an evil eye or curse us. But truly, truly, it is wonderful. But I know that sometimes we are in situations where the companionship is such that there can't be that much choosing anymore. So then you have to live with a lot of mindfulness and really always try to improve yourself and help the other also to improve. Now you will remember the verse, "A fool worries, I have children, I have wealth, yet he does not even own his own body or himself." How could he really own children or wealth? And here there is a story that while residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha came to know of a very wealthy man named Ananda in Savatthi or Shravasti. He possessed so much wealth, but he was very reluctant to give anything to anyone. This occurs again and again in the stories about the Buddha. And he used to say to his son, whose name was Mulashri, "Don't think the wealth we have now is very much. Don't give away anything from what you have. You have to make it grow. Otherwise your wealth will dwindle away." And the rich man had 5 pots of gold buried near his house and died without revealing it to his son, Mulashri. And later, he was reborn in a village of beggars not far from Shravasti. And from the time that his mother was pregnant, the income of the beggars in that village decreased, became even less. The villagers thought there must be some unlucky energy around. There must be something wicked going on. And they inquired about any recent change that had come about. And they came to know that the pregnant beggar, that this lady who is also a beggar, that she became pregnant and that she must be the source of the misfortune. And she was driven out of the village. So her lot became even worse. And when her son was born, the son was very repulsive. Nobody liked him. And whenever she would go out begging by herself, she would have some income. But when she went out with her son, she would get nothing. So she would sort of let him go out and beg by himself, which is terrible, of course. But that was the situation, that he seemed to bring so much misfortune, even on her. And one day, which is very common among 3-4-year-olds, he came to his old home in Savatthi and he remembered the house. This occurs very often among children and is ignored by parents who don't have that cultural background. They just ignore that the children are actually recognizing something from a previous life. So he remembered his old house and his past existence. And he went into the house. But when the sons of his own son, that means his grandsons actually, the children of his own son Mulashri, when they saw him, they were frightened of him and began to cry. And then the servants threw him out of the house. So at this moment, the Buddha was on a round of alms, and he saw this incident, and he asked his own disciple, who was also called Ananda, to bring Mulashri, the son of the other Ananda who had died. So Mulashri came, and the Buddha told him that this young beggar boy was in fact his own father in his previous life. But Mulashri could not believe it. So the Buddha had the beggar boy brought and asked him to show them where he had buried his 5 pots of gold. And it was then that Mulashri accepted the truth, but was so impressed by that occurrence that he became a very devoted lay disciple of the Buddha. Means he didn't become a monk, but he became a lay disciple like all of us, and his attachment to wealth and possessions vanished, and he realized that he's just a custodian of wealth, and that wealth has to be used for the benefit of others, not for the sake of accumulating, but rather for the benefit of course, one's own family, but also others. Very interesting story. And I think I've told some of you this story, that once I was present personally with a little boy. It was not our son, it was another boy, and he was at that time, I believe, 4-something years old, and we were on a mule, and he was on a mule and I was on a mule, and his father, I believe, was walking, and suddenly the little boy points to a house in a village and says, "I used to live up there." And he'd never been to this area. It was very interesting. And his father did not believe in reincarnation or anything, and he was just sort of ignoring that. And then I was listening very carefully. And you see, I'm quite a sort of academic. I'm also very critical. Don't think I just believe everything, not at all. I'm quite critical. So I didn't goad him on. I just paid attention to what the little boy was saying. And he was sort of telling himself, it was almost like he was in some inner perception or something, or memory, like an inner film was going on. And he was saying, and I used to pick these flowers for my mummy, and then when I was, so he went on telling a few other things, and then he says, and then I wanted to marry this girl, but they didn't want me to marry her, and then when I was 32, I died. That was so interesting, that he was apparently recollecting some information from a previous life. And there was a professor, Ian Stevenson, he died a few years ago, who collected thousands of such anecdotes and stories and researched them meticulously. So not just hearsay, he researched them meticulously, so much so that one of the great atheists of our time, Sam Harris, says that that research is really something that should be considered by people who want to explore reincarnation. Very interesting. And I saw that myself, this boy talking about something that was not at all imagination. It was very concrete. It was giving very interesting information. Now the verse, Natam kammam katam sadhu yam katva anutappati yassa assumukho rodam vipakam patisevati. That deed is not well done, which one regrets after it has been accomplished. and whose consequence one faces with a tearful face and crying. The most powerful of all instructions. Always live and act in a way that you don't regret it later. At the moment of engaging in your action, in your inner states and in your outer actions, you can always ask yourself, will this be something to be regretted later? And here there is a great story, and I believe this story has been put in the form of the Āchārya comic book, because as a child, somehow I remember reading this story in the comic book series, which our son and myself read every evening, Āchārya beautiful comic books. Those of you who have children, really recommended to read them. But here, now from the original, also while at the Jetavana monastery, monastic garden, there was an occurrence where one day some thieves stole some valuables and cash from a house, and they came to a field and divided the stolen property among themselves, and then each went their own way. But one packet containing some gold coins was dropped on that field, and the thieves left it behind, unnoticed. And early in the morning on that day, the Buddha and his companions were just passing by that field, and with his super normal intuition, he saw that the farmer who was cultivating that field would become a great meditator, a great spiritual person, and that this day today would be the day his path would begin. So the farmer paid homage to the Buddha and then continued to plow the field, and seeing that packet of money, that bag of money, the Buddha loudly said to his disciple Ananda, "Ananda, look at that very poisonous snake." And Ananda replied, "Bhagavan, yes, indeed it is a very poisonous snake." And then the Buddha and his companions went their way. The farmer, hearing them, went to look if there really was a snake, but found the bag with gold. And a little greed arose in him, so he took it and hid it in his house. Now, in the meantime, the owners of the other property and the police, yes, in ancient India there were police, they were coming looking for the thieves, and they were tracing the footprints. And then they came to the farmer's home and they found the bag of money. So they beat the farmer and they took him to the local ruler, who, because the evidence was so clear, ordered the farmer to be executed. And on being taken to the place where people get executed, the farmer kept on repeating, "Ananda, look at that very poisonous snake. Bhagavan, I see the snake. It is indeed a very poisonous snake." And when the king's men heard this, him mumbling this again and again, being aware of the Buddha and the Venerable Ananda, they took him back to the king and said that he's saying these words, what could it mean? So the king understood that the farmer was calling upon the Buddha as a witness. And the Buddha being of such great repute, they were taken into his presence, and then the Buddha told the king everything that had happened that morning. And the king was relieved that, if this man had not been able to call upon the Buddha as a witness, he would have been executed. So the Buddha instructed the farmer that one should never do something which one might later regret, even if it is so tempting in that moment. We find some gold, we think, someone lost it here, and we keep it, or we allow our temper to get the better of us. At that moment we are filled with righteous fury, but then much later we regret it. Or we regret it just in our hearts because we know it wasn't right. We know that the truth is everyone makes mistakes. Therefore, to hurt someone, even if they've made a mistake, it always results in further hurt. As the Buddha teaches, hurting others always leads to more hurt. Only abstaining from hurt leads to peace. And then the verse, Mameva katam manyantu gihi pabbajita ubho Mameva ativasa asukicca kicce sukisminci iti balasya sankappo iccha manocha vadhati. Let everyone, both householders and monks, think that this or that has been accomplished by me. Let them be under my sway regarding all that is to be done. Such are the fancies of a fool. His desire and pride only grows. Once, when the Buddha was staying at the Jetavana monastic garden, there was a monk called Sudhamma and a householder known as Chitta. And one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, who was already quite old at that time, whose name was Mahanama, was invited by the householder Chitta to his home and was offered a wonderful meal, and then gave Chitta some very important meditation instructions. Chitta then became a wonderful meditator and later helped to build a monastic establishment in his mango garden, and there he looked after the needs of the monks and nuns who came there. And he established Sudhamma, the younger monk, as the resident teacher. And one day, the two chief disciples of the Buddha, the Venerable Sariputta and the Venerable Mahamoggalayana, came to this monastic establishment. And these were very impressive individuals. The Buddha himself had such charisma that when he gave a teaching, people would be transformed permanently. You have to consider the impact this man had. So much so that today there are, I think, almost 800 million people who follow his path. Tremendously charismatic. And also the spiritual power he had. With that power he could transform people. But his disciples were no less. Sariputta and Moggallana were also considered to be enlightened, or to have reached a very high state of spiritual realization. So when Sariputta gave a teaching instruction, Chitta reached a deep state of meditative insight. So, full of gratitude, he invited these two chief disciples to his home the next day. And he also invited Sudhamma, who was the local resident in his monastic establishment, was the local teacher. But strangely, Sudhamma refused and was upset somehow and told him, "Invite me only after these two have gone." But Chitta said, "No, please, please, you have to join us." And again, Sudhamma turned down the invitation. And the next day, when he was invited, Sudhamma said that he would not sit down. He would just have the alms and he would go. So something was clearly wrong. And Chitta asked him what was really the problem. And he said, "I don't want to stay in your monastery any longer." Sudhamma then went to the Buddha and told him that he didn't want to stay at that monastic garden anymore. But the Buddha, with his great super normal intuition, knew the truth. The real truth was that in Sudhamma's heart there was pride. He wanted to be the main person. He didn't want Sariputta and Moggallana to be given such honor. He felt that only he deserved such honor because he was the resident teacher at that monastic garden. So the Buddha told him that, "You have heard this lay disciple, Chitta, who is endowed with such commitment and who is so generous. You had better go back to him and own up your mistake." But now Chitta was upset. Sudhamma went back, like Buddha had said, and wanted to apologize. But now Chitta, the lay disciple, was upset. So Sudhamma returned to the Buddha and told him that Chitta doesn't want to speak with him now. So the Buddha told him that, "See, this is the result of pride. Conceit in your heart came first, Now, conceit or pride in the heart of Chitta came as a result. Therefore, we must always be aware of even subtle pride, subtle conceit that arises in us. Because its results, its consequences are so complex. Others react to our emotions the same way we react to their emotions. And a highly complex wheel of emotions emerges through that. And as long as there are these emotions in us, we cannot come out of the wheel of samsara. If we die without having resolved all emotions, all emotional entanglements, 100% we are bound to be reborn. I know that in general Hindu teachings, nowadays people rarely point this out, except good Vedantic teachers, really good Vedantic teachers who are teaching the Gita and the Upanishads on a very deep level. This is my observation, I might be wrong, that it is really the Buddhists who still remind us of that as long as these emotional entanglements are there, even if we have prayed to the gods or the deities so much, just it's simply not possible to come out of samsara. We will drop back into the next birth. And we also have these teachings in the Hindu scriptures, but the tendency, in my opinion, nowadays is to think that if we are constantly doing japa, if we're constantly praying to the divinity, then everything will be all right. But that's just not true, you see? And we find that in the Sri Krishna's Gita, we find it in the Upanishads, we find it everywhere. So the Buddha's teaching on emotions, emotional entanglements, and that of the Gita and the Upanishads is absolutely identical. Only it is no longer emphasized so much. So I would really request all of you to take this very seriously, to resolve your emotional entanglements. As long as you have some enmity, some subtle hatred, envy, jealousy in you, you can't get out of samsara. It means you will be reborn and you will have to go through another life. And it might be just as messy as this one or worse. So please take it very seriously. Now, if someone has a question, Ria, someone remarked that don't husbands and wives have this codependency? Yes, indeed, because we were talking about codependency. Yes, unfortunately, where it doesn't really work out so well, there is this codependency, and that's a big problem because they can't then evolve spiritually very well because they're codependent. So they can only evolve when the other one evolves, right? So they have to evolve together. Someone says, could you please say something about if we find ourselves in the company of people who are not behaving in ways that are helpful to us? Yes, this is where we have to take a distance. It is nothing to do with attachment or guilt or aversion. Understanding that people who are simply not good for us and good for our spiritual development, it's very important to understand that and then to take a distance. It is not a wrong way forward if we do that. Taking a distance doesn't mean we hurt the person. Satyam vadet, priyam vadet. that we speak the truth when it is kind and lovely. Otherwise, we have to take a distance innerly, and sometimes that resolves many issues. Just taking some distance. It doesn't mean we are black and white, or we say, I will never talk to you again. You are a bad person. You are bad for me. No, that's just as melodramatic as it can go. But simply take some distance. Don't engage. Come back to your center. Come back to your mind. Come back to your path. And things will resolve. Then someone says, thinking about the line beginning with "the fool always desires something new." How can we be mindful of this yet still pursue progress in terms of livelihood, finance, education, etc., which is necessary in our lives? It's a very good question. In fact, I think just this morning I thought about some similar subject, that today we are living in a world that thrives on the new. That every 2, 3, 4 months there's something new, or every year at least. And everything is, the whole mentality is like upside down from ancient times, where in ancient times it was about finding contentment with what we have and developing spiritually, going inward. And today everything is going outward, and everything is moving outward. So yes, it's such a deep question, such a big challenge. And as you say, when we don't go along with that, then it's sort of, we remain stuck. So if we don't pursue the new in terms of our livelihood and education, then ultimately we are the ones who remain left behind. And the others progress and we remain behind, and we say that, oh, the Buddha said, don't pursue anything new. Then I think we are the ones who remain stuck. But my dear, I don't think that is what the Buddha means. Remember, the Buddha is always teaching enlightenment. And many people pursue spirituality with a desire for something new. They pursue the spiritual path thinking, now that I am spiritual, something new will come, something better will come. I will reach a state. I'll reach a state where finally I will always be happy. And I think it is this kind of newness, this kind of something that leads you away from yourself that he's talking about. Whereas the true spirituality is the one that understands the contentment is right here with us. It is right here in our own awareness. It is not in the past. It is not in the future. It is right here. When discontentment arises, you cannot solve that discontentment by finding or trying to find something new or something different. You can actually solve it by finding back to your own true nature, which is right here in the present, by simply coming back to yourself and observing that discontentment, acknowledging it completely, totally embracing and observing it till it appears in its true nature. The discontentment is just a state arising in you. And when you acknowledge it and observe it, it actually begins to dissolve. And that then is the true contentment. So I think it is more subtle then it appears on the surface. But, my dear, perhaps when we apply it to possessions, do we really always need the newest things? Can't we be a little bit content with what is? The way that children these days are worries me a lot. Always the newest. The youth always pursue the newest novelty. They can never stay with something for a while. What does that lead to? The older generation, they worked step by step. They had phases in their life where they committed themselves to something and then they grew like that. But the younger generation, sometimes it worries me. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. And each generation says that about the new generation. And they also have wonderful, wonderful qualities. But there is this obsession with new things always. And I think here the Buddha's teaching is quite important and opportune. And someone then says, I understand if you accumulate papa, which means negativity, it will result in more suffering in the next life as well as the current one. Will it become increasingly difficult to get out of the negative state forever, like an interest rate that accelerates debts? Or is the opportunity to get out of it fair for everyone? It is always absolutely fair. It is always just to the extent that that cause produces that effect. But the more we engage in negativity, the more that negativity comes back to us, and then we are in sort of a low state of maybe depression or a low state of attentiveness, and our mind is just always in the negative states as well in their result. So then it becomes sort of difficult. That's why it's called a cycle, you see? It's a cycle. It becomes difficult. But it is always absolutely fair. You see, this is all self-created. Whatever, in every situation, in every moment, we have the choice to come out of it, to engage in the positive, to engage in kindness, compassion. It is never too late. There's every moment the freedom to come out of it and to give yourself a push. And I can assure you, the moment you engage in Maitri, the moment you wish all beings to be happy, you are already coming out of it. The power of Maitri is such that you're already coming out of it, and it produces punya. It produces auspicious states. So, if you are in a negative spiral, just lift yourself out of it with Maitri and go into a positive spiral, and you will see it will only get better. Then someone says, I'm reading a book called The Laws of the Spirit World. It is an interesting read for life after death. Wonderful. I've heard about it. I think it is quite similar to the Buddha's teaching. So, my dears, here we end. We wish you a wonderful weekend. Remember, you can always come out of any negative spiral through Maitri again and again and again. Let the Buddha inspire you. Let all the great masters of ancient India inspire you to find equanimity and positivity. Iti Om Sham. That means thus Om peace. May you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.